Greetings once again, Rebels and fellow Star Wars Destiny players. Today, as promised, I'm bringing you a video about deck-related verbiage. We're going to cover a number of terms that describe what decks do, or at least how they're supposed to function anyway. And most of these words are the kind that you're going to hear all the time. People might ask you, so what kind of deck are you playing? And you're going to be able to respond confidently with phrases like, I run a sweet aggro deck, dude, or I'm going to mill you out, bro, or, whatever else your brain comes up with. All right, enough horsing around here. Let's get this going right after this. The idea of tiers isn't a concept that is foreign to gaming in general. Heck, even fighting games use tiers to describe the power level of their characters. And what you need to know about tiers is that that's just what they are. They quantify the power level of various decks in the meta that the competitive scene has decided are the best decks. And tier 1 is considered the highest tier, and then everything below that is less powerful. So generally speaking, in Destiny, you only ever really hear about tier 1 or tier 2 decks, tier 2 being the less powerful. But sometimes you hear about a deck that people place in like tier 1.5, and what they mean by that is it's the only deck that kind of consistently beats tier 2 and sometimes beats tier 1, but we're not going to like shift all the tiers for one deck. And even more rare are decks that are referred to as tier 0, which means they are relatively unbeatable for whatever reason. And that could refer to a deck that just has like insane synergy in its cards to the point where there's very few or almost no hard counters, whatsoever to it. But the truth be told, tier 0 is really a myth because everything is beatable in Destiny. We are talking about a dice and card game after all, right? Tempo is a really difficult word to bring meaning to in Star Wars Destiny, but I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll tell you what I think is a good example of a tempo deck. And tempo means what it means. It means a pace or pacing the game. And generally what tempo decks try to do is set the pace at which your opponent plays, either through control of his dice or control of their cards, while also placing their own smaller but growing threats on the table. And I want to clarify that all decks in Destiny have a certain tempo to them, but not all decks are trying to control the tempo of the game on both sides. Certain deck archetypes actually do tempo much better than others, such as the mid-range decks, which live and die by tempo. But some decks just want to focus on controlling tempo from start to finish, and we'll talk about mid-range decks in a few minutes as well. Destiny at its core is supposed to be a game of tempo. You go, I go, and that's how it's supposed to be, but we all know that's not exactly how it is. Another word that sometimes comes into play here is ramp, like ramping up or building up towards something. And that's a really important Destiny element, because it allows you to discard previous upgrades to discount the cost of new ones, right? So upgrades have ramp built right into the rules. And tempo decks take advantage of things like ramp to force an opponent to be on the defensive when they really want to be on the attack. And the tempo deck essentially causes like a constant conundrum by forcing your opponent to always be making decisions of control versus aggro based on what the player playing the tempo deck is doing. So in a sense, it can be really annoying to play a tempo deck. And it should be noted that tempo in Star Wars Destiny often comes in a form of dice control, right? Like I said before. But shields are also a really important part of tempo, and knowing when to let your opponent resolve a damage die that you can absorb is really, really essential. And I think that a really great example of a tempo deck, or at least the closest thing to it in my imagination, is a deck with Han and Rey. Because Han creates a ton of shields with ambush cards, which Rey wants to have played on her to get the additional actions, which helps her maintain the pace of the game, stay ahead of most decks, and set up a board state that's advantageous, which then makes it really difficult for your opponent to recover from. And if you've ever played a very good competitive Han Rei player with a very good deck, then you've probably experienced a turning point in a game where that deck began to, as they say, turn the corner on you, which is the moment that you realize, I think that I've now been outpaced by this deck, and no matter what I do, I'm probably going to be on the defensive forever and never recover. And the reason for that feeling is because this particular deck type uh, allows for that because of the card selection. And those players know how and when to play those cards in the right order in order to maintain the pace that they want the game to be played at. A control deck in its purest form does not necessarily exist in Destiny because of the amount of cards needed to pull it off hasn't quite reached a level where it's possible to just control your opponent as a win con. And in fact, in Star Wars Destiny, controlling your opponent is never going to be a win con because the only two that exist are completely milling or discarding their hand and deck or defeating all their characters by aggro. And just to make sure I define it, control at its core is the ability to undo or overwrite your opponent's every or most action or actions to maintain a favorable board state for yourself. Now, we've actually seen one deck that could be considered kind of close to control, and that was Funkar. And even that deck was not 100% control. And when I say that this is the only deck we've actually seen, I mean like in the competitive sense. And this deck's time in the spotlight in the Spirit of Rebellion meta was relatively short-lived. But what you do see in Destiny is control cards sprinkled into many or all competitive decks. And most competitive players would agree that having 6 to 8 control cards in your deck are actually very, very important to winning. And control cards come in a few different variants, right? There's dice removal, which is known as mitigation, dice re-rolling, stuff like doubt and sound the alarm, and even discard cards can be considered control cards like friends in low places. Heck, even cards that allow you to peek at your opponent's hand can actually be the start of a control deck because the knowledge enables you to play around what the opponent might possibly do, and you're armed with that knowledge, right? So, I think a lot of people are waiting on bated breath for Empire at War to drop because they've seen some of the new cards spoiled being added to the game, and a lot of them have heavy control elements, much better than the stuff that we've seen so far. And these new cards coming out could very well be the missing piece of the puzzle for those decks that are trying to make control a powerful and viable option in competitive Destiny. Aggro decks are what you will run into on a regular basis. And aggro decks win con is simply put, kill via damage. That could be melee damage or range damage, take your pick. Find some characters you like, go to get some upgrades, go to town with some lucky die rolls. That's aggro at its core. But there are some things worth talking about as far as aggro decks are concerned. Now, aggro decks gauge themselves by damage potential, and that is looking at the total damage you can do in a round and making decisions in the game to make your way as close to that number as possible. So, for example, a standard Vader Raider deck can potentially output 9 damage for 1 resource with God rolls, as they're called. And that usually just means rolling optimally for whatever you're trying to get. In this case, it's damage. But that's really unlikely, and the damage potential on a given round is probably more like between 3 and 6. As we can assume, at least one of these die is going to be controlled. And the maximum damage potential is sometimes referred to as a ceiling. And there's also a floor that represents a sort of minimum expectation. And as you build up your characters in upgrades, that ceiling gets higher. And so decisions begin to be made around, do I play this upgrade to increase my damage ceiling by X, or do I want to mitigate this die in my opponent's pool? And that's because losing a character is really an aggro deck's worst nightmare because they're relying on characters to generate damage. And the problem with aggro decks is that they're generally not very good at controlling the overall tempo of a board state, because instead what they're trying to do is just beat the opponent down before the opponent can kill them. And even knowing all this, the current meta still favors quite heavily aggro decks because the other major deck types like mill and control aren't quite there yet in their card selection. And we're hoping that's going to change and that these decks can be a bit more competitive. As an aside, too, I think it's worth mentioning the term hyper aggro. And a hyper aggro deck is one that tries to overwhelm you with damage faster than any control or tempo deck can actually manage. And right now, the two tier 1 decks in our meta are actually hyper aggro decks. So Poe Maz is considered hyper aggro because Poe abuses cards like Thermal Detonator and U-Wing to create a lot of spread damage. And there's simply not enough cards in the game, nor actions in a round, to heal all that damage before you simply become outpaced by it and essentially die. The other character, FN2199 on the villain side, is also hyper aggro because he rolls each one of those weapons you played in immediately, and then he gets to re-roll them later in the turn if you didn't overwrite them again, and you just kind of sit there taking oodles of damage, and you can't respond to it, and so eventually you run out of HP faster than you can heal it, and you're getting outpaced. So just think of hyper aggro cards as those that outpace the ability to heal and mitigate, and you'll understand this term pretty well. So we've been mentioning this one for a few videos now, and it's mill/discard archetype. And the win con for this type of deck is to run your opponent out of cards in both their deck and their hand. And this is totally plausible in Destiny. I've played actually a bunch of mill decks, but never to like a lot of success. Actually, wait, hold on. I have to take that back because I took 4th place at a tournament just yesterday with a modified version of a mill deck. And I actually won half a box of Empire at War, which I'm going to pick up next week. But and that felt good. But I want to take a moment, though, to differentiate between these two words because I feel like they get confused a lot. And mill specifically means taking cards off of someone's deck and putting them in the discard pile. And discard means taking cards out of their hand and putting them into the discard pile. And people often use the term mill to mean both of these things. And that is inaccurate. But it's sort of excusable in Destiny because you need cards that do both in order to meet this particular win con. So that said, the reason you don't see a lot of mill right now is for 2 reasons. And the first reason is there aren't enough cards to make it super competitive while also making it super consistent. That hurts it probably more than anything. And the second reason is because of the dominance of the hyper aggro decks in the current SOR meta. Now, if you ask me, honestly, I don't see that changing a whole lot, but it looks like FFG is really, really trying to make mill like a viable competitive archetype. They're giving heroes cards like General Riken in the next set, but this card's probably going to fall flat on its face, just like the people who are going to attempt to actually build a deck around him. But I don't really want to digress too much about, talking about individual cards. And besides that, we'll see how it all shakes out, 2 weeks after this video is even published. So not really worried about that. What you should take away from it is that mill and discard is a viable deck archetype, and it is a viable win con, but it just needs a few more cards to be considered truly competitive right now in Star Wars Destiny. There are actually 2 ways to define the word combo. The first is combo deck, and that is based entirely on a single combo, usually consisting of several cards that all work towards the same win con. The second and more common way to define combo is a small set of cards in your deck that improve the chances of something happening that contribute to your overall win con. In Destiny, almost every deck has some form of combo or some combos associated with them, and there are actually very few pure combo decks, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we discuss JANK. But a simple 2-card combo that you've probably already heard of or seen is using Unkar Plut with something like Imperial Inspection or My Kind of Scum, and this can enable additional interactions with your die when you roll a disrupt or when you resolve a disrupt side. And, combo decks aren't a standalone concept in Star Wars Destiny, and that may just be because a 30-card deck only allows for like so much room to put things in, But for the new expansion, people have already started looking at a hero like Hera and a card like Quad Jumper and beginning to think about what other cards they could add into the mix to make this combo really work out. So the idea here is that you use Hair Special to get out a quad jumper, and you roll it out, you get something out of its die. Then you use the action on quad jumper to get 3 resources to pay for a U-wing for 2 more. You roll in the U-wing for the first time and resolve its die for something, and then you're going to play Reckless Reentry, and you're going to get to roll that thing's die a second time. And the negative effect on Reckless Reentry can't take place because the U-wing can't possibly roll a blank. So you resolve that die the second time this round, and then who knows? Maybe you play strategic planning and you ready the U-wing again, and now you're activating it for a third time this turn. And this combo obviously requires a lot of cards to set up, but it can be a really interesting combo chain if you get lucky, and the potential on something like this is actually quite high. Now, a mid-range deck is what happens when an aggro deck and a control deck make sweet, sweet love, and what you get is something in the middle, or mid-range as we call it in CCGs. And the idea behind a mid-range deck is to control the board early, ramp up your damage slowly, and then when you are in a favorable position, pull back that control and finish strong, overwhelming the opponent with more aggro and less control. And this is a deck that is said to play what we call a swing game. So the way you can think of it is if aggro decks are rocks and control decks are like scissors, then mid-range decks are the paper. They do really well against aggro decks and not so great against control decks, which just kind of stop them in their tracks during the ramp-up portion of their game. And there actually is one deck in Star Wars Destiny that was considered pretty solidly mid-range, and it was the Snap Ray E-Maz deck that did win a store championship or two, actually. And the idea behind the deck was precisely what a mid-range deck wants to do. It controlled the board early while playing some smaller upgrades, then eventually got a big beefy bowcaster or two on the table, and it blows your opponent away. And it actually did fairly well in the meta for a while, but that's before people figured out how to take it out, which was primarily kill Maz as fast as you can. And a lot of this was before FN decks became what they are now. JANK or janky is a sort of catch-all term that describes oddball decks that win games in casual play at random for almost no good reason. JANK can also refer to a deck that puts together a small set of cards that work on paper, but almost never in practice. But when they do, it's really glorious. And for that reason, janky decks are actually combo decks that lurk somewhere in the bottom tiers of competitive play, which means non-existent in competitive play, essentially, right? But one such deck is the Launch Bay and Salvo deck, and this idea has actually been around for a while, but it's never been competitive, despite it looking like it would be a really sweet idea. And the idea that drives the deck is to draw a ton of cards, then get a Launch Bay on the table, and turn its die to a ranged side somehow, because the X in the die actually equals the cards in your hand. So if you've somehow managed to accumulate 12 cards in your hand, then that die represents 12 ranged damage. The idea is then to use Salvo from your hand to resolve that die against all an opponent's characters so that you can kill them all at once. And if you did that, the die would actually be worth 11 damage, I want to note, because playing Salvo actually removes the card from your hand and places it in limbo. And another jank deck that is one that uses Poe, Dameron, and 2 hard guns, along with Thermal Detonator and Scavenge, to name a few, but also Maz's Castle and Tactical Aptitude, and just a whole ton of cards. Because the entire deck is a combo unto itself. And the idea is, just like the Launch Bay Salvo deck, is to cycle and draw your entire deck into your hand so that you can find a Thermal Detonator. Then you want to play it with Poe Dameron, and then you want to cycle it back into your hand with Scavenge, and you want to keep using it in that sense. And it's a combo deck that's attempting to achieve huge amounts of aggro, and while it sees some success in the hands of like skilled players, it actually probably just as well, because people are wondering what the hell you're doing to begin with. And at least until they see the first thermal played, and then they're like, oh, you're scavenging it back into your hand repeatedly. Wow, that's really obnoxious. And you know what? Let this be a lesson to you, Rebels, that the element of surprise is not to be underestimated in Destiny, because these janky decks can come out of nowhere and just jaw-dropping stuff happens. And it's a lot of fun to come across people who are really seriously good at playing a really janky deck like the ones I've mentioned. And lastly, I also want to give honorable mention to planned explosion decks in this section. If you're interested in what I mean by that, you're not familiar with the card, go check out the card and get back to me when you've built some janky deck that can actually make it work reliably, and extra points if you can win a kit tournament with it. All right, folks, so we've made it to the end of this video series, and I gotta say, it was quite a journey for us, and I do hope, as always, that you've learned a little bit about Star Wars Destiny that you didn't know before. You know, these videos are a lot of fun to make, and I enjoy spending the time doing them and teaching you guys about Destiny, and I feel like that's ultimately what this channel has become. My pal Sugi over at Knights of Ren was actually helping me tease out this very idea about what this channel is essentially, and that's where it's at. It's about teaching. So in the future, I'm going to continue to make educational videos for players of all skill levels and keep my fingers crossed that enough people enjoy them to subscribe. And, you know, that'll motivate me to keep going and to make more videos, even though I really don't need a whole lot of motivation to do it. I really do just enjoy it, just to enjoy it. And so, you know, as we turn the corner, the big question then becomes, well, what's next, Gray? And honestly, I don't have an answer for you. You know, there's definitely some deck tech videos I could do, but I feel like that's something a lot of content creators do, you know? I was also toying around with the idea of a video that talks about choosing battlefields, and another one that discusses the meta around resource management beyond just the 2 resources that you get at the start of an upkeep. So if you, as a listener, have some sort of preference, I'd actually really love to hear about that. So post in the comments if you've got something to say about it, and I'm going to read them all. So that wraps this one up, Rebels, and I will see you next time right here on YouTube. And until then, be safe, and may the Force be with you.